The sun has set. Looks like it's time for Uncle Matt to tell you more bedtime stories. Fair warning, these are not your usual creepypastas. They all come from the twisted mind of author Christopher Maxim, who delights in exploring horrors of the mind in a most unusual way. Before we begin, visit the description of this video and be sure to follow Christopher, as well as follow my Discord, where I talk to you guys daily. And now, if you're ready, let's begin. Here are the 5 scariest creepypastas that will keep you up at night. Part 4. The Room 371 Experiment. A man named Garrett was experimenting on a room in a laboratory, but this was no normal room. It's a special place where time and space run differently, and people who enter it experience nightmarish visions. One night at the lab, when Garrett was supposed to be meeting his pregnant wife Elizabeth at a local hotel, he fell asleep while working. He had a nightmare where he was at the hotel room with Elizabeth. She was screaming on the bed. To Garrett's horror, the baby was on its way. As Elizabeth howled in pain, she finally gave birth, but this was no normal baby. It had a disturbing visage, as it had a wide, inhuman grin. As it stared at Garrett, its eyes filled with jet black and stared into his soul. Garrett put the baby down onto the bed, unable to look at it any longer out of pure terror. But when he turned to Elizabeth, a further horror revealed itself. She had died giving birth. In a panic, Garrett tried to run from the room, but that was when he saw a number on the inside of the door. The number 371, the same number as the room back at the lab. When he opened the door, he was met by a shadowy figure that said, "They're mine now, Garrett." It was then that Garrett woke up safe and sound at the lab. But realizing that he was running late, he called the hotel and spoke with Elizabeth. She told him that her water had just broke. She needed to get to the hospital immediately. It was then that she revealed that the room number where she was staying was 371, and Garrett's blood ran cold. He told Elizabeth to immediately get out of the room, but the call ended in static. Garrett rushed into the laboratory room 371, thinking that Elizabeth was somehow imprisoned there. But the room was empty. Instead, the door slammed behind him and a shadowy figure appeared. The figure told Garrett that the room itself was alive, and that the experiment there had trapped an ancient, malevolent cosmic being. It needed souls to stay alive. By keeping Garrett in the room, the being could now physically reach his family and feast on their souls. Garrett did the only thing he could to save his family. He tried to end his own life in the room so that the connection would be lost. But it was just then that he woke up outside of the room in safety. But the figure suddenly reappeared, telling Garrett that it would be only a matter of time before his family's souls were devoured. The InDream Hotline. A man was being terrorized by horrific night terrors. The dreams all revolved around his dead father, whose body was never recovered after a swimming accident. He had been with him in the water when it happened when he was just a child. Having to revisit such painful memories on a nightly basis, his soul was shattering. He needed a way out. As if responding to his prayers, he received a business card in his mailbox. The card stated that there was a new company service set up to help people escape their nightmares. All a person had to do was find an old red rotary phone in their dream and pick up the receiver. That would bring an end to the terror. But the man thought that the whole thing was probably a prank by his friend Josh, who knew about the dreams, but he was willing to give anything a shot to escape his grief. That very night, a nightmare came to him. In it, the moments before his father's death played out. Only this time, instead of his father disappearing into the waters beneath, he began to transform into a hideous sea creature. Gills protruded from his neck, tentacles grew out from his lower half, and large sharp teeth glistened in his mouth. Suddenly, the man was transported to his childhood home, and he was being chased by the thing that his dead father had become. That is when he saw it, the red rotary phone in his parents' living room. Picking up the receiver with the creature nearing, a voice spoke on the other end of the line. The voice informed him that the only option available was to transport the creature somewhere else to end the nightmares. As if the entire house had been transported to an icy atmosphere, the horrible creature froze in place and then vanished. When the man woke up, he felt not just relief, but as if he had finally gotten over the death of his father. That was until he heard his father from the other room. At first he sounded friendly, then the smell of seawater filled the air. His father, tentacles, teeth, and all, had been transported into the real world, and he was hungry. Heaven's Dark Secret. In this creepypasta, we learn about a dark fate waiting for some of us after we die. The story takes place after a car crash. A man was badly injured as a result. The pain of his injuries were an agony that he had never known before. He just wanted the pain to end. He remembered being in the hospital, surrounded by hospital staff, but he knew he wasn't going to make it. His injuries simply seemed too severe, and it was then that he died. But that wasn't the end of the story. Suddenly, he found himself standing before a tall old man. Behind the tall man was a red door. The man informed him that he had indeed died, and that he was now going to heaven. But in order to get through the red door to heaven, he would need to give a sacrifice, and the sacrifice was his skin. It would be peeled from his body. The tall man then carved a row of numbers into the victim's arm and ushered him through the door. He was now alone in a room with no visible features. Suddenly, he felt as though his body was rushing at a great speed through space. All around him was flame, and as he looked down at his body, he realized that his skin was being peeled away. The agony was unbearable. Finally, he found himself floating through a white void, a place he thought was heaven. But instead of angels, it was populated only by the skinless, dead souls. The man then asked one of the souls, "Why did they take our skin?" And the soul replied, "They wear it." Then, without a warning, the man felt a jolt of electricity and found himself back in his hospital bed. He had been brought back to life. It should have been a happy ending, but soon after leaving the hospital covered in bandages, someone paid him a terrifying visit in a dream. It was the tall old man from heaven. He told the patient that the angels in heaven had grown bored and wanted to come to earth. But the only way that they could do this was to wear the skin of the dead. The tall man then told the patient that he was marked and had to go with him sooner or later. And when the patient woke, he looked under the bandages on his arm and found the exact same number that had been carved there by the tall man himself. Room sitting. In this story, a man was hired to spend 7 night shifts in a room in a large facility. It was an office room with several desks and computers. The man's new boss, Al, told him that between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. each night of the week, that he was simply to stay in the office and not leave until morning. However, there was a catch. He was given some papers with a list of instructions, and most of them seemed bizarre and nonsensical. As Al left, he told the new employee that no one had lasted more than 3 nights in the room, and to remember the most important instruction. If there was ever an emergency, he was to phone Al's cell phone, but never after 10:05 p.m. On the first night, nothing happened, but on the second shift, strange things began to occur. Each time, the man stuck faithfully to the instructions he had been given, no matter how terrifying the situation. The most frightening of these involved having to ignore a woman entering the room whose skin appeared to be falling off of her bones. You might think that no one would dare come back for a 3rd night shift, but the new employee did. He needed the money badly and was now curious about what else would happen in that room. That night, a knock came at the door, and it was his boss, Al. One of the rules specifically stated that Al should not be allowed into the room unless he knew the password, but there was no password on the sheet. So when the employee asked Al what the password was, Al said, "I never gave you one." And that was good enough for the employee. However, when Al entered the room and started typing at one of the computers, the employee recoiled in horror. He turned the instructions over to see the password had indeed been written on the other side. What then had the employee allowed into the room? He then remembered the most important instruction. It was an emergency after all. He called Al's phone number as instructed. Soon, Al entered the room quietly, snuck up behind his doppelganger and choked him out. The doppelganger then vanished as if it had never existed. That was when the employee looked at the time and realized that he had phoned Al after 10:05 p.m., breaking the instruction. That meant that whatever had entered the room wasn't Al either. The employee then ran from the building and did not return for a fourth night. The rental. Jack wanted to finish his novel, and so he agreed to rent a large, quaint home on a small, isolated island in Cape Cod. When he met the owner, a man named Garrett, Jack was given a piece of paper with in-depth instructions on what was and what was not allowed in the house. He was told the place was special, and if the instructions were not followed, Jack was in for a bumpy ride. The instructions were many, but 4 in particular were of interest. No lights on past 11:25 p.m. Only 2 people should be let into the house, one named Hank Penston and the other called Jessica Covenwood. He was to ask for their last names to be sure. The third was not to go out between midnight and sunrise. And the fourth was to call Jessica Covenwood in an emergency via an attached number. The instructions stated that this call should only ever be made once. Garrett, the owner, then left, stating that he would only be back on the morning Jack was going home and not ever before. This meant Jack would be stranded for the duration of his week-long stay. He unfortunately broke the rules straight away, venturing out to look at the stars after midnight before going to bed. Waking in the early morning, he arose from his bed and opened the bedroom door. But he did not understand what was happening. The door opened onto a completely different hallway, this one far longer and narrower than before. The walls were lined with a large number of doors and rooms and other hidden places. With nowhere else to go, Jack left his bedroom and walked along the corridor until he reached the final door. On it was the number 371. Opening the door, there was no light inside. A shadowy figure then leapt at him from the darkness, and he passed out. When he woke, it was morning, and he was back in his bed. Jack thought that it had all been a dream. He went back downstairs and continued writing until a man named Hank came to the door. Jack remembered the name Hank from the instructions, and when he said he was there on Garrett's request to put locks on all the doors, Jack let him in. But then Jack remembered about the last name. Once Hank was in the house, he gave a different second name when asked. He was not who he said he was. Jack fled from the house and called Jessica Covenwood immediately. She told him where to find a circuit breaker outside of the house as Hank ran towards him trying to stop him. When pulled for 10 seconds, it would make the madness end. Jack followed the instructions and found Hank gone and everything back to normal. He did his best to stick to the instructions by the letter after that night. However, on his last night on the island, he was so enthralled in his writing that he forgot to switch off all the lights before 11:25 p.m. Panicked, he ran around shutting everything off at 11:26 p.m., but it was too late. When in his bedroom, the door slammed behind him and a thick black smoke poured out from under the bed. Something was inside the dark smoke, and he had no intention of staying in the room with it. Jack leapt through a window and out into the night. The impact on the ground knocked him out. When he came to, the island and the house were suddenly being battered by waves from the sea. There was nowhere to hide but inside the house. Terrified after hearing the voices, Jack phoned Jessica Covenwood once more. She soon arrived and told him that she would fix everything. She took Jack back upstairs and showed him the same strange, narrow, thin hallway that had appeared before. Then she told Jack that the only safe place was room 371. So they went inside, and it seemed that they were welcomed by the spirit there, which vanished from their sight. All they had to do was wait until morning. Then it would all be over. That was when a horrible feeling of dread came over Jack. He asked Jessica what her last name was, and she did not reply. Instead, she shapeshifted into a hideous creature, and Jack knew he was done for, but at that moment, the creature began screaming as the sun finally rose and streamed in through the window. Struggling with it while it was weak, Jack killed it and fled from the house, waiting for Garrett to finally arrive and pick him up on the dock. If you want to read more of Christopher Maxim's work, be sure to check out the subreddit in the description below. And remember to join my Discord now at discord.gg/Matthew Santoro. It'll be the first link in the description. I promise you'll love it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.